Go Trent.
All right, thanks, Doug. Yeah, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to spend with us here. I'm gonna do a nice overview of what we saw the last month, and then even beyond that. And you can see by this picture kind of what the flavor is going to be. This is some burned out bean fields in Ohio, and that's sort of the flavor of what we're going to talk about today. So general information here, kind of start out with some housekeeping stuff. This has been something that's been going on for many years now, providing climate services to the central region. It's a great collaboration between many different entities, state and federal. Like Doug mentioned, we're going to have open questions at the end. You can access future climate webinars, not quite yet, but when they're posted, and past recordings, both at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Centers. The website's there. And just a look ahead, next month's webinar will be on the 17th of October. And that'll be given a tag team by Austin Pearson at the MRCC in Indiana State Climate Office and Brad Rippey at USDA. So let's get going. Here's an outline. Recent climate conditions. We're going to go back to August, get some summer review because climatological summer has ended. We're going to talk about some events and impacts. You can see there's not really a whole lot except for drought and a little bit of extreme heat, but we'll talk about all those things, and then we'll get some outlooks from the next 7 days all the way to maybe a little bit of hint at winter. All right, let's start with some recent climate conditions. Just want to highlight this photo here provided by Aaron Wilson of a tree in his neighborhood that is turning colors, early fall. A reminder that it is September, but also because of that dryness, we've seen some early fall conditions. All right, so start with August here. Now, these maps are rankings of average temperature on the left and total precipitation on the right for the month of August. So what you can see for temperatures is that we were not record warm or cool for August, warmer than average or warmer than normal near the Great Lakes, close to normal in the west, not extremely, like I mentioned, extremely warm or extremely cool anywhere. You can see that along the southern plains and in Florida, they were near the top warmest August, but we had a little bit of a cooler haven here in August. And then on the for precipitation, it was dry across a lot of the Corn Belt, but not extremely so. So again, these rankings for Kentucky and Ohio mean it was a top 21st, top 26 driest August, and a little bit wetter in the Dakotas, closer to normal in the Great Lakes. So, August wasn't extreme by any means in the region, but we did have some warmer, have some drier conditions, especially in the eastern part of the region, that really added to that drought. And then summer as a whole. Now, climatological summer is again June through August, and these are the same maps showing the rankings for temperature, average temperature, and total precipitation for summer, but this is for the entire climatological summer. So the north central region, I'm going to call it a near normal haven. Doug called me on this earlier when I was calling a cooler than normal haven, because you can see by these rankings, nobody was really cooler than normal. But when you look on the coasts of the U.S., we have several states that were actually the record warmest summer: Maine, Florida, California, Arizona. And then we have this little white area in kind of our region. So even though it wasn't an extremely cool summer by any means, we were pretty close to normal across much of the region, especially kind of that upper Mississippi Valley region. And what's interesting, though, is again that dichotomy. It was the fourth warmest summer on record for the contiguous U.S., but again, our region was pretty close to normal, an anomaly for the country. And as far as precipitation is concerned, you can see the rankings here: the green meaning they're wetter, the browns meaning we're drier for summer. So we are wetter than normal in the upper Mississippi Valley. Top 5 wettest on record summer in Wisconsin and Michigan. A lot of that coming in June and July, especially June in those regions, less so in August. But we were also very wet in Minnesota as well. And then you can see these single-digit numbers here in some of our states: Ohio, Kentucky, and we'll bring on West Virginia for this discussion. Top 10 driest summer on record in each of those states. So I mentioned the dichotomy in temperature, but even just within our region, we had some big differences in precipitation. And that's what I wanted to show here. This is total summer precipitation as a departure from normal. And you can see anywhere in green, we were wetter than normal. Anywhere in kind of the brownish, we were drier than normal. So, of course, the rivalry between Michigan and Ohio spans many things. In this case, it also spans summer precipitation, where in parts of southern Michigan, they were 4 to almost 10 inches wetter than normal in some places. And you only have to drive a couple 100 miles south to parts of central and southeast Ohio, where you were 4 to 10 inches drier than normal for the summer. So, again, some big differences. And we really saw we saw, as I'll mention here in a little bit, we saw drought expand across much of the region. But as far as the most intense drought this last season, it was really centered here in eastern Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. So that covers the summer as a whole, but really the last 30 days has seen a much different flavor across most of the region. So what I'm showing you here is total precipitation on the left and over the last 30 days, and on the right is that total as a departure from the normal over the last 30 days. So this takes us back to August 21st or so. So you can see here, not a whole lot of rain to speak of. Some places of North Dakota, Minnesota, and very far southern Missouri getting 4 to 5 inches of rain. And those are really the only areas that were above normal as far as precipitation is concerned. A big area of red on the right map indicating that, from basically the panhandle of Nebraska all the way across to our border here between Ohio and Pennsylvania, we were anywhere from 1 to 5 inches drier than normal over the last 30 days. And many of these places have had 1/100th of an inch, 2/100ths of an inch, essentially spit on the ground. So it's been extremely dry since mid-August. Racking up in some cases, like I mentioned, 3 to 5 inch deficits. And this is something I wanted to mention too, because this is a time of the year that we are typically pretty dry across much of the region. Some parts of the region, like in parts of Colorado, this is a wetter time of the year. We're transitioning from monsoon to kind of larger scale storm systems, but especially across the eastern 2/3 of the region, this is our typically driest time of the year as far as hydrology is concerned and stream flow. So it's not necessarily rare to go a week or maybe even 10 days without significant rainfall, but in some places going 2, 3, pushing now 4 weeks without measurable rain is actually quite significant. So to represent that, what I'm showing you here, this bar plot, is the total precipitation across the entire north central region from August 1st to September 15th. And that goes all the way back to 1951. And what we see is that the amount of precipitation on average across our region since August 1st is the lowest, therefore the driest, since 1976, about 2.8 inches on average, the driest since 1976 across the region, and the 5th driest since 1951. So we're talking about decades now that we have to go back since we've seen the kind of dry conditions since the beginning of August that we've seen this year across our region. So to say that September is typically dry is true, but this has truly been extremely dry for the region over the last 45 days or so. All right, so let's switch to temperatures for a little bit. Temperatures over the last 30 days, the map on the left is our average temperature departure from normal. So anywhere you see greens, we were a little bit cooler than normal over the last 30 days. Anywhere you see reds and oranges, that's where we're a little bit warmer than normal. So, definitely see a difference between east and west here. Average temperatures were 2 to 8 degrees warmer than normal in the plains and parts of the upper Midwest. We were near to slightly cooler than normal in the eastern Corn Belt since mid-August. I will say, though, that we've seen some pretty big swings, and that's really what the map on the right is showing you here. Despite being warmer than normal across much of the region, we did get that big burst of pretty cool air in late August, and that got us down to some pretty impressive low temperatures across the region, even in places that didn't have significant elevation. So you can see that the map on the right is our lowest minimum temperature we've observed over the last 30 days. And talking about getting down to some teens in Colorado, but even in the east when we don't have our elevation, you're talking about getting into the mid, in some cases low 30s, including a couple of mid 20-degree low temperatures on I think it was the night of August 31st or September 1st across parts of Minnesota. So even though a lot of the region has been warmer than normal, especially the last week and a half or so, we have seen some tastes, although fleeting, tastes nonetheless of fall air across the region. To link this better with maybe some agriculture and ecology, talking about growing degree day accumulation, we're either at or nearing the end of the growing season across much of the region. You can see here the map for kind of the eastern part of the region here of growing degree day departures from normal. Most of the region, we're seeing growing degree days that have run near average in the Western Corn Belt and slightly above average, 50 to 250 growing degree days above average in the east. When we look at these map differences between Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota and the Dakotas especially, we'll see this lines up fairly well with that, with where the crop is as far as progress is concerned. Of course, this is one part of the equation of crop progress. The other part is the moisture. But that's all to say that we're not, as far as growing degree days are concerned, we haven't been extremely ahead or behind in our accumulation. Just as a shout out to the awesome crop growing or corn growing degree day calculator from the U2U project that's housed at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center. I'm just showing an example of those growing degree day accumulation in red here relative to kind of normal from Stark County in north central Illinois. And again, you can see here, we've been tracking just, at least in this part of Illinois, we've been tracking slightly above normal growing degree days since kind of mid-May. And this is just, again, a shout out to this tool because we can kind of overlay the occurrences, the historical occurrences of freeze events in whatever county. And of course, this is using the example of Stark County, but you can use whatever county you'd like to from this calculator. So the URL's down there, and it's a neat tool to play with, especially during the growing season. All right, let's talk more about drought. And this is probably the biggest story of the region. Not probably, it's most definitely the biggest story of the region over the last month or so. So this is the most recent U.S. drought monitor. It was released today. It's current as of Tuesday, September 17th. And what it shows that nearly 40% of the region is in at least moderate drought. Big variability. We have some severe to exceptional drought, or excuse me, severe to or extreme to exceptional drought in parts of Montana. And then just wanted to mention, we had, you can see the dark red here, exceptional drought in Ohio. The first D4, which is that exceptional drought in Ohio since the U.S. Drought Monitor started back in January of 2000. So as long as the drought monitor has been going, Ohio has stayed out of exceptional drought, but this is the first year that they've fallen into there. And so we're talking about some pretty severe, well, we're talking about exceptional drought in this region, but even a more expansive drought across parts of Missouri, Kansas, Illinois, Indiana. So, and like we've talked about, some of this is recent, and I'll get to that in a second because of how dry it's been, and some of this is sort of legacy drought just because we haven't gotten enough rain over the last several months. And these are the change maps from the U.S. Drought Monitor. So each of these maps show the change in the category of drought. Anywhere you see kind of the yellows to browns, that's a degradation or a worsening of drought. And anywhere you see greens is an improvement of drought. And I have two maps here, that change in drought conditions since August 20th on the left and since June 18th on the right. What you can see is that a lot of much of the drought onset or intensification that we see in our current drought monitor map has occurred since the start of summer, including almost all of it in Ohio. But when we look at parts of the kind of central corn belt here, a lot of the deterioration in our drought conditions have come since mid-August. And that's, again, even though we had in a lot of parts of Missouri, Illinois, and even Iowa, pretty significant July rainfall, it's just been so dry since mid-August that we've seen a lot of those soil conditions deteriorate, stream flow deteriorate. I'll talk about pasture and other crops here in just a second. And so a lot of that drought intensification across much of the core part of the central part of the region it has occurred in the last 4 weeks or so. We also have seen it maybe doesn't stick out as much as the browns do, but we have a little bit of green in western Colorado and parts of Montana. So we've seen some improvement since midsummer in those regions. Okay, so I mentioned deteriorating soil moisture conditions. The two different kind of perspectives of soil moisture. The left one is USDA subsoil moisture conditions. And I wanted to show these instead of the topsoil because this time of the year our topsoil is usually pretty dry. Just because, again, we're kind of at the end of the year where we've had a lot of transpiration, not as much precipitation this time of the year. And so what I really wanted to show here is how dry the subsoil moisture was. And what this is showing is the percent of subsoil moisture in each state that is ranked short to very short. short. So you can see, I mean, 100% short to very short in West Virginia. That's quite impressive, I guess, in a bad way. 91% in Ohio, though. But even, you know, across much of the region, I think that the lowest percent that we have is in Minnesota of 16%. And we've really seen a lot of these states outside of Ohio and kind of the Central Plains really increase the amount of subsoil moisture that would be considered short to very short over the last few weeks, just again because of that lack of rainfall. For a little bit more of a detailed look at where those really dry soils are, this the right map is showing our percentile of soil moisture. So this is sort of similar to the percentile rankings that the U.S. Drought Monitor uses, not exactly, but close to it. And this is for the top 40 inches. So again, pretty deep down. I will say that this really dark red is likely valid in some places, but it may be a little bit overblown. That this system has a tendency to overestimate drying and kind of drought magnitude this time of the year. It's a really tough time of the year to get hydrology right. You know, crops are starting to ramp down on their transpiration and root water uptake. Again, it's pretty typically dry, base flow decreases, so it's a tough time for models. So it's likely overblown in some places, but the general pattern is really what we want to pay attention here to, and that is that across much of much of the region here, from North Dakota to Ohio, we have pretty significant deficits in our top 40-inch soil moisture, and it's really we have to get to either northern Minnesota or out in the western part of the region where we begin to see some of those soils that may be a little bit wetter than normal. Certainly maybe not wet, given that this is a pretty dry time of the year, but wetter than normal nonetheless. So this is all to say that you know, we had, again, coming into July and in a lot of the region or coming into August, I should say, from July, we had pretty good soil moisture in some of these regions that has just been depleted because of how dry it's been over the last 30 days or so. And, you know, as we would expect when we start to drop those soil moisture conditions, and especially as those shallow groundwater conditions, those water tables drop, our base flow for our streams also begin to drop. And so our stream conditions are showing stream flow drought or hydrological drought across a lot of the region. This is a perspective, a map that shows a 14-day stream flow by our Huck watersheds here. So anywhere you see orange, red, that's where that watershed is considered in some phase of either below normal or much below normal stream flow. Could be considered hydrological drought. So you can see again in our kind of core drought region here of Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, we see quite a few, if not most, watersheds in that stage, but you know, quite a few across Kansas, Nebraska, and even some along the Mississippi River, some of the tributaries to Mississippi and Missouri and Illinois as well. So you know, we've seen recent drought degradation in parts of the Corn Belt that has really more affected soil moisture than it has stream flow, but certainly in those areas that have been dealing with drought for several weeks now, parts of Kansas, Nebraska, and again Ohio and Kentucky, that it is transitioned to a full-blown hydrological drought. And you know, when we see hydrological drought along the tributaries to our major rivers, it adds up to oftentimes hydrological drought or stream flow drought along our major rivers. So I want to break down our three major rivers in the region here. The Mississippi River has reached low flow stage once again on the lower Miss. The bottom plot here is a combined observations of stage, the height or the level of the lower Mississippi River at Memphis, and then the forecast where that level may be headed. So you can see we've been in low stage or below that low stage for almost a week now, if not over a week, and the forecasts are for that to continue. I did want to put out here just this star indicating the level of the Mississippi on October 1st of last year. As many of you, if not all of you know, this is an issue, low flow in the Mississippi, that we've been dealing with now for 3 consecutive years in the fall. And so this is just to say that although our forecasted level for October 1st coming into the new water year on the Mississippi this year may be a little bit higher than it was last year, it's well below that low threshold nonetheless. So dealing again with issues of curbing of barge traffic and dredging that has to take place. Part of the reason, if not much of the reason for low flow on the lower Mississippi has to do with drought along the Ohio River basin. So the top plot here is the same kind of plot as for the Mississippi, but this is for the Ohio River at Cairo here in Illinois. You can see observations. We've been dipping in and out of that low flow or that low stage for the last week or so, but the forecast is decidedly taking us below that low stage over the next several weeks at the Ohio River. Now, the reason I kind of link these two together is really important to understand that this time of the year, and actually for the year as a whole, the Ohio River contributes about half of all of the flow in the lower Mississippi as it's measured at down in southern Mississippi. So the Ohio River is even though it's not nearly as large as far as the area of a tributary as the Missouri, for example, because it's a wetter climate, it contributes a lot more of the flow. And because, I mean, as I've shown throughout this talk, we have been dealing with really significant drought conditions in Ohio, in Kentucky and West Virginia, kind of that upper Ohio basin region, and more recently, pretty dry conditions in the lower Ohio and parts of Illinois and Indiana. So that flow that is typically expected to contribute 50% to the overall flow in the lower Mississippi from the Ohio is right now contributing about 10%. So that's one of the big reasons why we're seeing those low flow stages along the Mississippi. The Missouri River, I put no major issues here, doing okay. In fact, when I mentioned the lower contribution of the Ohio River, the Missouri's trying its darndest to try to make up for that. And so typically the Missouri River will make up about 10% of that flow, and right now it's closer to 20 to 25%. So thank goodness we have that, because we could be seeing even worse levels along the Mississippi if the Missouri wasn't contributing that. So, but overall, a fix to lower Mississippi River levels is either rain over that watershed or more consistent rain over the Ohio River. And as expected, this time of year is fire season in many places, and with the drought that's ongoing in many regions, we have fire issues really across the region. So wildfire is currently burning in Wyoming. I have images that were provided from the short draw fire, as well as the Remington fire, which is along the Wyoming-Montana border, currently burning several 100,000 acres of wildfire between Wyoming and Montana that or forests have burned so far. Having some wildfires that reports in Colorado, as well as grassland fires in South Dakota and forest fires in Minnesota as well, that have been more contained than the ones out in Wyoming and haven't burned quite as large of an area, but nonetheless still a problem. And even with as I'll maybe hedge a little bit here and say that there's better chances of rain in the next week across much of the region, the overall pattern is still pretty dry, and therefore wildfire will likely be an issue moving forward. And I'll show those maps here in a second. At the same time, farther east, less forest, but field fires, especially in our agricultural areas. So field fires have been a concern, and in fact, there's been field fires that have been popping up in parts of Ohio and Indiana. Just a call out, this is something that we've been hitting really hard here in Illinois, is that the dry weather has been not bad for drying down the crop after it reaches maturity, but taking that hot farm equipment through a really dry field can be problematic. And so there's increased fire risk as harvest really begins in earnest. So just trying to caution folks to be careful, take their time, and make sure to have a plan in case we see that ignition. And this is actually something that we're seeing in the wildland fire outlooks. So these are the outlooks here. Any region you show, or I show here in red, has an above normal wildfire or wildland fire potential. This does not cover field fires. So I should just make that clear, and that's part of the reason why we have kind of a split here between, for example, southern and central Illinois, but overall just wildland fire potential. And I'm showing you here the monthly outlooks for October, November, and December. So for at least for October, we're seeing a lot of the region, including most of the most of the entire Ohio River basin here, because of how dry it's been, is above normal wildland fire potential. So again, taking note across our wooded areas across these regions, as well as our agricultural areas, the potential for fire ignition. And in fact, there's been dozens of counties between Ohio and Missouri that have already enacted burn bans this year over the last month or so. November, we see it becomes more contained, parts of Kentucky, and then in December, we expect that of course somewhat naturally that wildland fire potential to decrease. So it's really the big area in October here, that eastern region, just because of how dry it's been. Okay, I wanted to hit on Great Lakes just quickly. Nothing super noteworthy about Great Lakes temperatures and levels right now. Pretty close to average. Superior and Michigan are running about 2 to 4 degrees above average as far as temperature is concerned. All the other lakes are within a degree of average. And as far as levels are concerned, most of the lakes are very close to average for this time of the year. Lake Erie levels are slightly above average. I mean, this isn't surprising given that even the most significant drought in parts of Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, hasn't really been there for more than maybe 6 months or so, and it usually takes a longer period of time of dryness before we see that response in the Great Lakes Basin. So, like I mentioned, nothing super noteworthy about the Great Lakes right now as far as temperatures and levels are concerned. The only thing is Superior, Michigan, again, running about 2 to 4 degrees above average. Okay, I'm going to switch to impacts and notable events. I want to show here the much acclaimed Minnesota State Fair. Last month, they dealt with some pretty significant severe weather issues, which were noteworthy because of the damage they caused to, in this case, a place called Noodle Selfie, but also noteworthy because it was one of very few severe weather events across the region. So let's talk about that when we get into impacts here. So agricultural impacts. I'm breaking it down between row crops, pasture, and specialty crops. Row crops right now, we're seeing biggest impacts in those most significant drought areas that have been dealing with drought since the heart of the growing season. Poor to very poor conditions on corn and beans, and I'll show the maps here in a second, in Ohio and parts of Kentucky. Elsewhere, we've been dealing with more rapid drying, and that's if we go away from those really significant drought areas, that rapid drying is sort of a bittersweet kind of experience, because in some cases, for that earlier timely planted crops across parts of Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and beyond, that rapid drying can be a benefit to a start of a timely harvest. At the same time, some of the later planted crops that haven't quite reached maturity yet, or are just getting to maturity, have gone the last 30 days in parts of the Corn Belt without significant rainfall, which is less than ideal. So expecting to see probably some differences as far as when that crop was planted, just because of the timing of that dryness. The outlook, or I should say the condition for pasture, is much less varied. Its pasture conditions across much of the region have really deteriorated over the past 3 to 4 weeks. And I mentioned earlier that this dryness in the fall is something that we've dealt with in the low levels in the Mississippi each of the last 3 falls. At the same time, that dryness has really affected pasture over that time period as well. Little to no regrowth after the last cutting of hay. And a lot of producers are starting to feed hay as supplemental now because just the lack of that pasture conditions. Of course, we see concerns over water quantity, with some folks having to truck water, but also a lot of water quality issues, as those toxins can accumulate during those dry conditions for stock ponds and things like that. So again, this is one of those conditions, one of those time of the years as the row crops begin to really mature out, we start to harvest. It's really the pasture where we see some of the biggest impacts as far as agricultural drought's concerned. Specialty crop impacts, especially from drought, have been primarily focused in Ohio and Kentucky. So we've had some reports of fruit and nut abandonment on trees, trees dropping green apples in Ohio, for example, in some orchards, which is not great. Smaller fruit size, especially on those apples, and some early maturity. And then insect pressure. The insects are looking for food and water as well, and vegetables and fruit are out there for them to feast on. So that insect pressure has been a problem over the last month or so. We've also had some issues of wheat planting and germination, or I shouldn't say issues, I should say concerns, as the planting conditions in those extremely dry soils are less than ideal for that germination. So hopefully, if we can get some moisture in the ground before we see wheat planting in earnest across much of the region, that would be good. To this point here, crop conditions. You know, I mentioned that the biggest, as far as row crops are concerned, are corn and beans. The biggest impacts in Ohio, and to a lesser extent Kentucky. So this is showing the maps of percent good to excellent, corn condition on the left, bean condition on the right. I mean, what we can see here is that I'm sort of conditioned to not say it's a good year because of pushback, but you know, it's been a decent year for a lot of the region. Still some pretty good corn and bean condition in much of the region. Better than this time last year. You can see in Iowa, for example, 29-point year-over-year increase in percent good to excellent corn. Illinois 22. I mean, Missouri 51%. Just thinking back to how bad things were last year in Missouri as far as corn condition is concerned. Similar things with beans as well. And even some of those areas that were dealing with significant delays up in Minnesota and Dakota, still, you know, double-digit point increases on good to excellent bean conditions. So, so good condition overall, but you can definitely see where those drought have taken a toll, right? I mean, we're seeing big decreases in percent good to excellent in corn and beans in Ohio, to a lesser extent Kentucky, but still there, and then Kansas as well. So for much of the region, it's been a good year. For some places with that drought, it's been less than good. As far as our progress is concerned, it's definitely a west to east gradient. Anywhere you see green in these progress maps, that's where we're ahead of progress. Anywhere brown, we're behind kind of that 5-year average. The left map is a percent maturity for corn. The right map is soybeans dropping leaves. And what we can see here is, again, that east to west. Those areas, if you think back to that growing degree day map that I showed, the accumulation, those areas where we're 50 to 250 growing degree days ahead of average, as well as having pretty timely planting in much of the eastern part of the region. We're also ahead on the corn progress and bean progress as well. In some cases, very far ahead, and that has to do also with the heat and the dryness that we've experienced. Look at Illinois, for example, where 23% more percent mature corn than the 5-year average. On the other hand, where we've had some wetness issues earlier in the growing season, perhaps not as large of a positive departure for growing degree days. In the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, we're seeing some crop delays. Not substantially so, where we're talking 30 or 40% differences, but delays nonetheless in corn maturity as well as soybeans dropping leaves. So that's something that we'll have to watch, because of course this is a region that we start to watch this time of the year for freeze and frost as well. So that's something that we need to take note of. We'll probably talk more about in our October webinar. And then I mentioned the pasture. I can't get away without showing the pasture map. This is a percent poor to very poor pasture conditions, and this isn't changed from last year. This is a change just from the last week. So you can see some big increases in poor to very poor pasture conditions across parts of Illinois, Indiana, farther west in Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana. And of course, then you see the big drought areas where, again, 75% of pasture conditions in Ohio are poor to very poor. So, this is, again, the time of the year where row crops are whittling down. Pasture conditions are really important, and unfortunately, we've just been too stinking dry across much of the region over the last 30 days to really get those good pasture conditions. So we've seen impacts from that, dispersal and herd reductions, at least in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois in recent weeks, probably other states as well in response to that. Other drought impacts we see, this is a weird time of the year to have drought, just because we also tend to have climatologically the lowest or the driest, kind of the lowest stream flow, the driest hydrology overall. So we can have ecological impacts as well. And we've seen that trees are dropping leaves, and we're seeing early senescence. I showed that image of that tree in Ohio that was changing colors already. My black gum has changed colors already, which is the earliest that I've had it in at least the last 5 years. So we've seen some early senescence, as well as some limited fall color. Some of the trees are responding by just browning their leaves and having them fall off, as opposed to seeing that bright, brilliant color. So we've also seen some fish kills. I don't want to make this seem like it's a widespread problem, but some reports of fish deaths along the Ohio and the tributaries, especially regarding carp. And from what I can understand, from what's been reported, that's been more of an impact from the water temperature as well as oxygen levels. So when we see those stream levels decrease, as we've seen. It means there's less water in those channels, which means that the energy that we're getting from the sun, those temperatures are increasing that water temperature quite a bit more, and that's affecting the health of fish. So that's where those fish kills are occurring. And then this time of the year, we also see big challenges with nurseries, with watering demand. This is when they like to kind of start switching their demand to start responding to winter as winter approaches, but having to water because of the summer-like temperatures across much of the region, but also because of the drought is a real issue. Recreation and tourism, I've seen some boats being ordered to be removed from docks on some Ohio lakes because of those low dock levels, not trying to damage those boats. Fireworks and other events have been canceled across county fairs because of those dry conditions and burn bans in dozens of counties across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky, at least, if not across other parts of the region as well. We've seen water resource issues, especially in the kind of the core drought region of Ohio and Kentucky. Water conservation, both voluntary and mandatory in some communities, as well as some reports of rural wells going dry in parts of Ohio and eastern Kentucky. And then public health, these are some interesting reports. I actually got pinged with this yesterday. Unpleasant smells in Chicago, or maybe I should say particularly unpleasant smells in Chicago, due to the fact that the city has had less than 0.05 of an inch over the last 30 days of rain, as well as in other urban areas. And then West Nile virus concerns as well. We tend to associate mosquitoes with wet conditions, but the Aedes aegypti and other species of mosquitoes that can transmit West Nile actually prefer it a bit dry. They can outcompete other species of mosquitoes in these kind of conditions. So what we've had across much of the region where we were wet in July, parts of August, and then it just dried out, that really makes it a lot easier for that pooling of the standing water to accumulate and overturn tires and other kind of crap that people have in their backyard, and that provides great breeding grounds for these mosquitoes. So it's something to take precaution of as we continue with our dry pattern. And other kind of significant weather events, we've had some extreme heat, especially in late August. We broke dozens of daily high and low temperature records across the region in that last week of August, including there was 115-degree heat index value in Moline, Illinois, in the Quad Cities. And of course, that it was fleeting. It was fairly short-lived, but it worsened drought conditions, put on that plant and animal stress. We had some patchy frost in late August. That was a big flip where it was, 100 degrees in St. Louis, and then it was 35 degrees in St. Louis. And so that was a pretty big flip. And we had some record-breaking early occurrence of 30s, of getting down to the 30s, including in Springfield and Illinois. And as I mentioned, we got down to the teens and mid-20s across parts of the region as well. And then severe weather, I put that as an impact because we didn't really have a whole lot. I mean, I showed that picture of the severe weather impacts to the Minnesota State Fair, but otherwise it was a pretty quiet late summer, early fall. I'm knocking on wood here because if there's one benefit to drought, it's that we don't have as much severe weather tendency. We did get some tropical moisture from the remnants of Hurricane Francine. That's what the radar image shows you here. Is you can see Francine right now here coming off the Gulf into Louisiana and Mississippi. And I have this image here because I want to show the combined effects of dry air coming down from Canada and our very dry soils just rip that storm apart. You can see it comes into southern Illinois and then just falls apart. And just speaking from a local perspective here in Champaign, we were expecting 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rain, and it spit rain for like 5 seconds. So, that's just an example of when we are dry across the region, those dry soils can really take attacks on those storms as they're moving across. All right, moving to outlooks now. And a picture here from the Morton Pumpkin Festival, which is this weekend. So any of you who are around the Morton area should enjoy some pumpkin chili as we get going. All right, so the 7-day precipitation forecast is more bullish on rain across the region than what we've seen maybe in the last 3 weeks. So we may have a break in the dryness for parts of the region. Now, we should make the point of saying that we're still in this convective period of time, which means that it's not going to be a boom of rain for everybody across the region, but this is probably the best chance that we've had in the last couple of weeks or so. So you can see the QPF the next 7 days showing potential for widespread 1+ inch totals across much of the region. We'll see, again, I need to mention those dry soils can affect that rainfall like what we saw in Francine. So we'll see how much actually makes it to the places that probably need it the most in Ohio. Speaking of that, we do see drier conditions over the next 7 days. In fact, bone dry for much of the Dakotas and Wyoming and Minnesota or Montana. and also less relief for the lower Ohio basin with maybe a ½ inch or so for parts of southeast Missouri. But heck, you know, the way it's been the last 30 days, I mean, we take a ½ inch gladly because it's just been so dry. So, you know, that's to say that everybody, you know, don't bank on getting an inch or two of rain, but it looks like, again, the best chance for rain coming over the next really 5 or 7 days or so. I want to mention the outlooks for El Nino and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So we're currently ENSO neutral. So we're in the neutral phase of ENSO, not in El Nino, not in La Nina, but we are developing La Nina-esque conditions. You can see here from the map on the left, these are sea surface temperature anomalies, and that cold tongue sticking out from Peru here, Peru, South America, not Peru, Illinois, just for those who are geographically limited. We have our cold sea surface temperature anomalies here. So this is the beginnings of La Nina. We're officially not in La Nina yet, but those are developing. The outlooks, the blue bars that are kind of sticking up here for much of the fall and the winter, those are the highest probabilities of La Nina developing. So we have a greater than 70% likelihood of La Nina onset this season, so before the end of fall in December, and 45% of a moderate La Nina developing. So it's not just the whether or not we're in El Nino or La Nina, the strength of those anomalies can be important, not always, but can be important for how it affects our weather. And this is my annual reminder for that. Just because we have La Nina or El Nino sea surface temperatures develop, which is the sea surface temperature anomalies and the sea level pressures that cause, that's really the only thing that dictates whether we're in a La Nina or not. Just because we have that does not necessarily mean it plays a super important part of our weather. We expect it to, because it is a really important part of climate, but just because we're in La Nina doesn't necessarily mean it acts like a typical La Nina year. So that's just an important point here, that it's a really important part of our climate system, but it doesn't always act exactly the same. Our models are showing that La Nina is likely to persist through winter, though. So it will very likely be a La Nina winter. And just as a reminder, last year we were in El Nino winter. Now, what does that mean? I'll get to that in a second. I showed the 7-day forecast, a little bit wetter. Let's everybody, you know, cross our fingers and hope that it comes, because it looks a bit drier after that. So this is the 8 to 14-day outlook for the last week of September. Above normal temperatures for much of the region, below normal precipitation for especially the western 2/3 of the region. So it does look like we go back into that milder, drier pattern that has been plaguing us for a while after this weekend and early next week. Moving to October, October temperature outlooks leaning warmer than normal, farther west and a bit farther east, and most of us are stuck in the middle with equal chances, kind of a weaker signal, this white area of equal chances above and below normal temperatures for October. For precipitation, we're seeing this kind of drought tongue start to develop from the monsoon region across to the plains, even stretching into parts of Illinois and Indiana. Drier in the plains and southern Midwest, kind of equal chances of wetter and drier than normal October farther north. Seasonal outlooks, this is the outlooks for temperature and precipitation for the 3-month period between October and December. Again, milder overall across much of the region. The Northwest, we start to see some of signs of maybe not warmer than normal, equal chances of above and below normal temperatures. Precipitation, again, a bit of a mixed signal. Show up big time dryness in Texas, a bit wetter in the Great Lakes, but much of the region under those equal chances. So not a super strong signal from fall. And then winter, this is our kind of maybe our first look ahead to winter, climatological winter, December through February. Temperature on the left, precipitation on the right. Now we're starting to show some La Nina-esque flavor to some of this, especially with this slight chance of below normal temperatures for the very northwest part of our region for the wintertime. That's very La Nina-esque. And then even more so, this actually moderately or likely above normal precipitation across much of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley region, especially. That is also very La Nina-esque, and I'll talk about what I mean by that here in a second. But you know, and again, this is a 3-month outlook that is 2.5 months ahead of time. So with that lead time, of course, there's some uncertainty that comes with this. But boy, a wetter than normal winter would definitely be good for some drought relief across much of that Ohio basin that's been suffering for a while now. What I meant by La Nina-esque for fall and winter is what these maps are showing. So these maps are showing averages of temperature anomalies on the left and precipitation anomalies on the right by climate division for the last 30 or so years of La Nina events. So I show this is in the past 30 years since 1990 of La Nina events. Here's what our temperature and our precipitation patterns have looked like in October, November. And I put a big, I didn't put an asterisk, but I should have. This is not a forecast. This is just saying, what have La Nina's done in the past 30 years or so? And we do see some pretty big signals, right? Above average temperatures across the entire region, kind of centered over the Dakotas, Minnesota area, and a bit drier in the lower Mississippi and Ohio basins for again that October, November period in our past La Nina falls over the last 30 years or so. Same maps, only this is for winter, December through February over the past several La Ninas. And this is what I mean by that La Nina-esque, right? If you think about that outlook that I showed you for winter, cooler than normal across the northern parts of the region, not much signal, the southern parts, but this is where we start to see that wetter than normal signal, these green anomalies here. And it's not super strong, but it's there nonetheless, this average of wetter than normal conditions in the Ohio basin. And usually when we think about La Nina winters, that's what we think about. Tendency for cooler north, wetter in the Ohio basin especially, and dry in the southeast. That's very La Nina tendency. All right, then the drought outlook for October through December. So this is October through December. We see a higher likelihood of drought improvement or possibly drought removal closer to the Great Lakes, where it's expected to be wetter, especially later during that season, but also drought persistence in most of the existing drought areas of the plains, the Ohio Valley. That lines up with our drier than normal outlook for October through December as far as precipitation is concerned in those regions, and the possibility for some drought development in western Kansas and eastern Colorado that have been on that edge of drought development over the last 30 days and are likely leaning kind of drier than normal for October through December. So here's a summary, wrapping things up. Current conditions, much of the region has fallen back into drought. That dryness and the warmth over the last 30 days especially will likely progress harvest pretty well, but folks have to be careful with that increased field fire risk as well as blowing dust risk. Pasture problems, again, have plagued us across much of the region, and continued stress for livestock producers, and giving our outlooks not necessarily going to get better before it gets worse. Low levels in the Ohio and Mississippi rivers for a third consecutive fall. And as I mentioned, when we get drought along our big rivers, it takes a while to come back. It's not just one rain that's going to alleviate all conditions. So it likely will be a season of wetter conditions to get us back to where we need to be, similar to last year. Crop progress has been delayed for the last several months in Minnesota and Dakotas. That's a legacy of extremely wet spring, but certainly not record delay by any means in those regions. Some of the impacts from kind of that drought, we've seen some early fall color, some senescence in those drought areas. We'll also, just like a point here, we'll want to watch for that second year stress in young trees. Young trees, if they don't get enough water this time of the year, oftentimes we won't see that really significant stress or potential mortality until the year after. So that's something we'll want to watch for those young trees, because we want to make sure that we don't see that large mortality, especially in those managed lands. The outlook's best rain chances in weeks are coming over the next 7 days, all the way from Kansas to Ohio. Hopefully that system produces what it's expected to. Beyond that, outlooks are leaning more dry and mild for the last week of September. They stay dry for October for the western part of the region. It's not necessarily extremely wet for the eastern part of the region, so it's likely we'll stay in a drier, mild pattern moving forward. We do see outlooks start to show more wetness around the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley as we move into winter, and we're expecting above normal temperatures throughout the rest of the fall, potentially switching to a cooler pattern if La Nina does take hold, especially in the northwest part of the region. So with that, here's some further information. Again, all of our partners here, and of course this presentation, as well as all of our past webinars, are posted online for your perusal. With that, I'll turn it back over to Doug and help answer any questions. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Trent. And thanks everyone for sticking on here. Got a few minutes to go through these. There's a lot of things we could talk about in terms of La Nina and what it means or may mean. As Trent showed, the northern parts of the U.S. and the southern parts of the U.S. have the highest influence to both El Nino and La Nina. We're kind of stuck. Many of us are stuck right in the middle. So that's the biggest problem in terms of consistency from La Nina to La Nina or El Nino to El Nino. I think Dennis wanted to say a little bit more about soil moisture. So let's go there. And one of the first questions about what you showed, I think, on soil moisture, you can go back to that maybe, Trent, to your soil moisture maps. Someone was asking about the Sport LIS model soil moisture information percentile different. Is it okay? Percentile different from the percentile that the USDM uses. Dennis, what do you want to say about that?
Well, we've been batting this around among several of us in climate services this week, trying to understand what the models are saying from soil moisture and what the reality is. There are several national models that depict various assessments of soil moisture. And that's probably a half an hour of just talking about some of the different models and what they're trying to measure in the soil moisture. So the thing I put in the chat was that there are several different models that go into the US Drought Monitor along with a number of other inputs. So this is just one of various ones. But the other thing about this is that this is a percentile. So it's kind of trying to rank against other years. And Trent hit this really well, that soils are kind of dry this time of year. So it looks like a low percentile value, and it should be. But when you're ranking against other years, frequently we are dry this time of year. Trent, what else do you want to say about soil moisture?
Yeah, and that's why I kind of pointed at the pattern more than the absolute percentile, because the models can have a hard time capturing the absolute value of soil moisture and the absolute anomaly of it. And so it's generally the pattern. We definitely have very dry soils and down pretty deep too across a lot of these areas in deep red. Is it the driest on record or the second driest on record as the percentile would indicate? No, but likely not in many places, but dry nonetheless. So the pattern, I think, is more important than the absolute values here.
Right. Okay. And then, oh, I guess Chip, or no, yeah, Chip had one of our viewers said he was thinking Sport was underestimating soil dryness in some portions of Kentucky, showing too much improvement when it rains, while gauges show little or no improvement. So that's a constant thing, is the models trying to catch up with reality or even being wrong. I don't know on this particular model how much of that is real information, as in ground truth and whatever that means in terms of soil moisture, if any. So I don't know if you guys know.
Yeah, I mean, it has real meteorological observations of precipitation, temperature assimilated in it, and it's one of the more sophisticated models that we use for monitoring soil moisture or estimating soil moisture. It's just, this is a really tough problem.
Yep.
So it's one of the best tools we have, but it's not perfect, and so that's kind of the point I want to make.
And honestly, we don't have a lot of soil moisture gauges out there to gauge all of this. That's just another issue. Any other comments? Okay. Someone mentioned that they received only a trace of rain this month, and that quote unquote NIDIS put us back into D0. And we just want to clarify that NIDIS isn't the U.S. Drought Monitor, since the authors for the U.S. Drought Monitor, you can go to that map if you want to, Trent, actually come from the National Drought Mitigation Center, the USDA, and some regional climate centers, as well as the group I work for, the National Centers for Environmental Information in Nashville. So you can see down in the lower right who puts this together. NIDIS is sort of a part of the puzzle, but isn't the manufacturers of this information. Okay. Yeah, we mentioned wildfires burning corn and soybeans, but really, Trent, how important is that in terms of loss? Individual loss, not individual loss, general loss.
Yeah, general loss, it's not a huge issue. Individual loss, it's can be quite dramatic, you know, for the individual farmer. But as far as the overall depiction of you know the total amount of acres harvested, it's pretty small.
Trent, why does Chicago smell?
Is that an actual question, Doug? Did somebody ask, or is
Yes,
that your question?
they really want
Yeah.
to know. They want to know the source of it.
Well, it's you know, all of the things that people do, of course, can create lots of different chemicals and other things that don't smell particularly good. When we have frequent rain, a lot of that can get diluted and washed out into different water systems, treated and untreated. When we don't have that rain, some of those what's the word, substances may not be they may not be diluted, and they may not be getting washed out. And so that's part of the reason that we're hearing about more of these kind of smells, especially across our more densely populated urban areas like Chicago, for example.
Yeah, and I don't think Chicago's necessarily that unusual in terms of big city and no rain for a long period of time. Just for the record.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, this one just directly to you, Trent. Why was there less wildfire smoke or smoke in general in this case, central Illinois this summer?
Yeah, actually, I think last year was more unusual than this year. So last year we had a lot of really bad air quality days and across central Illinois, and a lot of that was due to the location of the wildfires that were sending us smoke. They were more central eastern Canada as opposed to the western part of North America, and the kind of circulation pattern that we had just brought that wildfire smoke straight south over the Great Lakes and right into central Illinois. So oftentimes we expect wildfire smoke, if it's going to affect us in the eastern Corn Belt, it's likely going to be coming across Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and it comes at a higher level in the atmosphere, and it tends to be more diluted, so it's not as big of an issue. But because these wildfires last year were closer, and because of the way that they were coming in at a lower level of the atmosphere, it really affected us more than we had this year. So I would find this year is more of an example of closer to normal than what we had last year, if that makes sense.
Right, and there has been smoke on and off. If you're looking at your sunsets or sunrises for that matter, and they're a beautiful orange, that indicates quite a bit of particulate matter in the atmosphere, which tends to be smoke.
Yeah, so, and we can see that this year or this time of the year with dust as well.
Yeah, true. Good point. Yeah. And when is this dry?
Yeah.
Dennis, any other observations, remarks you want to make that I'm totally blowing off that I shouldn't have?
That's a wide open question, Doug.
I know.
And you just give me a whole opportunity. No, I think we've touched on there was a question about, you know, corn and soybean acres burning. Really, it's been a few places. It happens every year. Even in the bad years, it's still not that significant a number of yield loss.
And Dennis, do you want to say anything about generalities in terms of, I guess, the major crops? I think Trent started that conversation saying, you know, I don't. But do you want to say anything else?
No, I think Trent hit it right. The overall conditions of the crop have been quite good through the year. They weakened some as the year has gone, as we've dried out. So we've probably knocked back yield a little bit, and the premature maturity will probably damage yield a little bit more. But overall, there's still going to be a lot of corn and soybeans grown this year.
Okay. Well, I will say this: our next speakers will be on October 17th, and the reason I'm pointing it out this time is that we'll also have a winter an official NOAA winter forecast at that time. Even though we can show you one now, the official one will be out in the middle of October, like I just said. And we'll have Brad Rippey from the USDA talk about sort of the end of season, a little bit about the end of season and how overall crops did, as well as the usual. Austin Pearson was going to talk about the usual outlooks and things that we normally talk about as well. So it could take a little bit longer. It's a year. It's kind of a wrap up of the growing season presentation. We're also planning on putting out some sort of, like we do almost every year, there's an El Niño or La Niña, a one-page document that sort of explains what the heck that means for various areas across the region. So stay tuned, and there'll be a lot more information. I want to thank Trent one more time, and Dennis for being on the call and helping out so much. So thanks, guys, and we will talk to you both later. Have a good afternoon. See you next month.